Okay. Want to do a sound check and make sure everybody can hear me. Is the sound check good? I can hear. All right. We're going to go ahead. We're like a minute early. We go ahead and get started. This is a very interesting chapter, and it kind of parallels some of what we've done in other books. So I think everybody finds talking about JFK fascinating. The way this ends up at the end of this chapter is going to be very, very interesting for everybody. So please try to stick around. Because one of the things that I was talking to someone else today about is it's so important once you get new pieces of the information on history is to go back and look at some of the more important elements of history and basically reevaluate them, which is what we're going to do at the very end. And I think you see context wise how knowing about Operation Cleo changes everything. Okay, so we're going to get started. The name of this chapter, we're on chapter 7, A Damned Murder, Inc. Kennedy's Battle Against the Leviathan, which is a sea monster. We start off with an interesting dynamic. They talk about the very end of Eisenhower's term and knowing what. Hold on a second. Brian wants me to send the link to the live so he can get everybody over here. So Eisenhower is a real interesting entity, transitioning from him into Kennedy. And I find what's interesting about it is that he surrounded himself with people like the John Foster Dulles as his Secretary of State and Allen Dulles. And then historians try to mark time as if it was an error. And lot in just a second. Okay, let's see if that makes it better. Is that better? Okay, let's try that again. Can y'all, is it better reception now? No? Okay. Hold on just a second. Hold on just a second. I'm going to have to come out here because and be closer to the, let's see if it works better. No. Okay, let's try it out here and see if this is any better. Can you come turn this off? Modern technology is so fun. Absolutely. So that's not any better. Might be better to do this just since the video's low resolution. I can definitely do that. It's worse. Holy moly. All right, let me turn off the video part of it and see if that makes it any better. Is it better now? Okay. Let me just call Eisenhower and see if it clears up a little bit. It doesn't. We may have to reconvene. We don't need to see you. Oh, come on, Brian. I'm sure people live just to see me on podcast. That's funny. All right. John's trying to help me here by closing the blind, but now I can't see. So, okay. Sounds great. All right. All right. So, my point is that we've been led to believe that the Eisenhower administration made errors, but errors for a long period of time. And if it's an error, then you can actually fire the person. So none of the people were fired. And that's problematic. So I just want to say that. Also, y'all can look up while I continue who was Eisenhower's vice president. That's something that's lost in the conversation a lot. So go ahead and post who his vice president was because it's very relevant. So basically, during the Eisenhower administration, you find a blurring between the CIA and military organization. So you have CIA pretending to be in the military. And I'll tell you a story about that in just a second. But you also have the reverse of that happening. So you have military that's basically on mission with the CIA, like embedded in their organization. And you also, and we see that in Gladio a lot. You're right, it was Nixon. And that's very, very relevant, Julie, because I want y'all to understand that Nixon thought he had the the JFK race locked in. Nixon was convinced he was going to be the president and not JFK. So you cheated. All right, good, Raven. So I want people to understand, just like a lot of people say that Bush Sr. had a lot of say in foreign affairs during the Reagan administration, I believe that Nixon was in on a lot of the stuff that went on during the Eisenhower administration, because there's a lot of things that went on during the Eisenhower administration that makes no sense if you study Eisenhower. So that's all I'm going to say about that. And to make the point of the merging of the CIA and the military over a long period of time, I worked at a organization, my first assignment as a lieutenant, that was highly classified. And also, there were people that work there, and a lot of people, because they were embedded in civilian industry, didn't wear uniforms and didn't look like they could ever be in the military. And they had records, which, if you're a personnel officer over time, you kind of understand what is a normal career. And they had reports that supposedly were legitimate, but if you know, they were not legitimate. if you tried to get a hold of people, we had an incident with one of these people who got into trouble in a civilian capacity. And when I was trying to locate whether or not he had any prior issues and tried to call some of the people that was in his record, they didn't exist. So the blending of the military and the CIA is a real thing. So we go on with the book, and in this book, it mentions a guy by the name of Colonel Fletcher Prouty. He's written several books. He was the liaison officer on the joint staff with the CIA for a very long time, up to about 8 years, if I remember right. So, approaching the end of Eisenhower's tour, and also keep in mind, when you change presidents, it gives the CIA about a 6-month window at the end of one term and the beginning of another term to do things that they otherwise may not be able to do. That's another pattern that I have found in doing this research. So Eisenhower in May of 1960 is working on a thing called the Crusade for Peace with the Ultimate Summit Conference with Soviet Premier Khrushchev in Paris. It was Eisenhower's clear attempt to push forward a peace initiative that was of his own and without coordinating with his State Department, John Foster Dulles. And obviously, the deep state, very much the international syndicate, did not want peace with the Soviet Union because they used the Soviet Union as the bad guy, and they had the intent of keeping that battle alive as a way of influencing elections and using it as justification for terrorism, the justification for taking over countries to grow poppy. So they can't afford for Eisenhower to make peace with the Soviet Union. It just can't be done. So the White House had directed that all overflight activity over communist territory cease during the upcoming summit. So they picked a date and they said, after this, we've got all the arrangements made for the peace summit. Y'all aren't going to do anything to screw it up. So no more flights, like with the reconnaissance, nothing. We're calling a freeze. So May 1st, that's a very interesting date too in the satanic world. 1960, a high-flying U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers left Pakistan on a straight line overflight of the Soviet Union in direct violation of President Eisenhower's directive. The U-2 crash landed in Russia. Amongst the possessions found in the plane were all of the things like identification of being a CIA agent, something that absolutely never happens. And I'm going to explain to you why in a second. So he's carrying all this identification. It's supposed to be a covert mission with no ties supposedly to the CIA. So in case y'all don't know, when you fly a mission for the CIA, you go through two processes. You are basically strip searched. Your flight suit and everything that you're going to be wearing, and for you too, it's a spacesuit. You have to take all your clothes off. They basically give you a very extensive body search. Then separate from that, they search all of the gear that you're going to take on the mission with you, and then you are married up and searched again. So you are not allowed, when you fly CIA missions, ever to have any identification at all, because it's plausible deniability. So the fact that he had information either planted on him or that he knowingly, because he was a CIA employee, actually brought with him to make sure Russia knew that, basically screwing up the peace conference. So the CIA was behind it. Now, what's interesting is for a long time, they told us that it had mechanical failure and it had crash landed. Alan Dulles' testimony behind a closed door session of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee was that the U-2 spy plane had not been shot down, but had descended because of engine trouble. Dulles was largely ignored by the press. Later, Eisenhower confirmed in his memoirs the spy plane had not been shot down by the Soviets and indeed had lost engine power and crash landed into Russia. So here's what the inside scoop is on why it didn't make it. So there's the U-2 plane, because of how light it is and glide ability, the glide ratio of it, can go long distances with not a whole lot of fuel. There is one critical part of the fuel, though, that is very finite, and that's the hydrogen that is mixed with the fuel because of the altitude at which it flies. So you could very easily, and it is in a container, so it's very easy to calculate, and it has to have it to fly. So if I wanted to make an aircraft land involuntarily, a U-2, I would put on exactly the right amount of hydrogen and make sure that he ran out at exactly the place where it's going to be the most visible and the least ability to talk your way out of. So that's exactly what happened. It was concluded that the quote unquote engine failure was a lack of the hydrogen fuel to maintain flight. It also was suggested that this identification stuff was packed into ours parachute pack, all of the identification that was later found. So basically, he was set up, and it was set up as a CIA operation to ensure that we did not have peace with the Soviet Union. And throughout this entire exploration of mine, I am reminded time after time after time when there was plenty of opportunity for the Soviet Union to do something against the European powers, and they didn't, kind of just like what we're seeing now with Russia. Russia didn't do anything when Poland entered the EU. He didn't do anything when all of these other countries on the border was taken into NATO or whatever. He drew the line at Ukraine, and that was showing a lot of patience. So to me, in all of this research, when the Soviet Union could have taken overwhelming force and been justified at doing it like this, which is a violation of their sovereignty, they never did. And that's a very interesting concept, because it runs contrary to everything we've been brainwashed to know. So just for name purposes, the Cuban exile program that we talked about was ran by the CIA by a guy by the name of Richard Bissell. He was deputy director of plans for the CIA. He's the guy that was behind the attempts on behalf of the CIA to assassinate Charles de Gaulle. He also just so happens, coincidence, to run the U-2 program for the CIA. So on January 5th, 1961, we're coming up to the end of Eisenhower's administration and the beginning of President Kennedy's. Eisenhower put on public record just weeks before Kennedy was to assume office that the CIA under Dulles had robbed him of his place in history as a peacemaker and left nothing but a legacy of ashes for his successor. So basically, setting up Kennedy is what Eisenhower's saying. Also, Eisenhower is quoted in the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. And I would argue he allowed it to happen. And that's what's aggravating to me is this is not a oh my gosh, look what happened to me. This is a guy that was in World War II. He knew all about stay behind units. He knew all about everything that was going on. And yet he put those people that ran the stay behind unit and everything else in his administration. So they either had something on him or he was complicit. I'm not going with the he didn't know story. So, in April 1954, Kennedy had stood up on the Senate floor to challenge the Eisenhower administration support for the doomed French imperial war in Vietnam. By 1957, Kennedy had again stood up and spoke out against French colonialism. This time he talked about France's bloody war in Algeria and how the imperialistic nature of Europe needed to end. And he basically called out the Eisenhower administration for being on the wrong side of history. And he did that on the Senate floor. He's quoted as saying, the most powerful single force in the world today is neither communism nor capitalism, neither the H-bomb nor the guided missile. It is man's eternal desire to be free and independent. The great enemy of that tremendous force of freedom is called, for what want of a more precise term, imperialism. And that goes like right to the heart of England and the fascists who's trying to create the New World Order. He's like stabbing them. He goes on, and today that means Soviet imperialism, and whether we like it or not, and though they are not to be equated, Western imperialism. So see, he's calling out both sides of the coin there. Thus, the single most important test of American foreign policy today is how we challenge imperialism. He also says, if this Western imperialism, then no amount of no aggrandizement of armaments, no new pacts or level conferences can prevent further setbacks to our course and to our security. So he's telling you right there the very reason why the imperialistic viewpoint of these people who want the New World Order is the most dangerous thing that we could have. So the book goes on and talks about Castro and Khrushchev coming to America and basically staying in Harlem, and he would then follow up their visits to the very same hotel and be quoted as saying this: behind the fact of Castro coming to this hotel and Khrushchev, there is another great traveler in the world, and that is the travel of a world revolution, a world in turmoil. We should be glad that Castro and Khrushchev came to the United States. We should not fear the 20th century, for the worldwide revolution, which we will all see, is part of the original American Revolution. And he's talking about the revolution for freedom, for sovereignty, for people to be able to rule their own countries. So again, another stab in the heart of the imperial order fascists. So June 30th, 1960, the independence of the Republic of the colonial rule of Belgium happens. Patrice Lumumba, minister, he gives a fire speech, quote, the humiliating bondage that has forced upon us, filled with tears, fire, and blood, we shall show the world what the black man can do when working in liberty, and we shall make the Congo the pride of Africa. We want no part of the Cold War. We want Africa to remain African with a policy of neutralism. And so again, we know based on our past book reviews, that marks him as a dead man walking. So Lumumba was labeled a communist for his refusal to not be neutral. So the CIA tries to coerce him into being a Cold War satellite, and he refuses. So he's immediately labeled a communist, just like they do today. He wanted a Pan-African, which we know from our first chapter is not allowed. The Africans have to be the slave colony of the European imperialistic people. So him saying that he wanted and he used those words, Pan-African, because that told them he was very much aware of what their Pan-American, Pan-Europe, Pan-British empire language was. So he's like sticking them in the eye saying, I know what you're doing, and we're not going to be your slave colony. So Kennedy would also work with and sought national sovereignty to end colonialism in Africa during the first months of his presidency. Lumumba would remain a grave danger, Dulles said, at a meeting in September 1960. And here's a quote: as long as he was not yet disposed of, so he's talking about killing him. 3 days later, Dulles made it clear that he wanted him permanently removed, cabling the CIA station, quote, give every possible support in eliminating Lumumba from any possibility of resuming governmental position. He was assassinated on January 17th, 1961, just 3 days before Kennedy's inauguration during the quote unquote fog of transition. And that's what I was saying. There's a window before and after the inauguration where the CIA feels that they have free reign to do whatever they want. Because they'll tell the incoming guy, oh, that was approved. Kennedy was clearly meant to put a stop to the murder Bella had created and was running, would declare to the world in his inaugural quote, the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans, unquote. So we'll see. Bay of Pigs, act of treason. And if you remember, this is what Dwayne said when we were doing our big reveal with Brian and Dwayne. He was like, oh, I'm going to have to go back and rethink my whole Bay of Pigs. And I knew this chapter was coming up. So the formation of the CIA, President Truman would later go back and say, oh, that was such a big regret. Again, I'm not buying it. If he had such a big regret, he could have gotten rid of it. They didn't. None of them did. Colonel Fletcher Prouty is quoted as saying, this NSC directive, talking about NSC Directive 5412 in 1954, which is during the Truman administration, for the first time in the history of the United States, defined covert operations and assigned the role to the CIA to perform such missions. And he later goes on and talks about the addition later on of the clandestine operations of the CIA, creating another national security memorandum, creating that as an official function. So instead of it just being an intelligence collecting apparatus, it becomes operational. Kennedy had also inherited a secret war with the communist Cuba that had been being ran by the CIA. JFK was disliked from the onset, both by the CIA and the military for his lack of wanting to be involved. And not military in general, just the senior people. The secret operations against Cuba was quietly upgraded by the CIA from the Eisenhower administration March 1960 approval of a modest support program of the exiles, which included small airdrops and over the beach operations, to a 3,000 man invasion brigade just before Kennedy entered office. Again, they took that 90 days to complete the Cuban operation. And Kennedy didn't know it wasn't already authorized. So a massive change in plans occurs. This showcases the level of hostility that Kennedy encountered as soon as he entered the office and the limitations of the president's power when he does not hold support from the intel nor the military. Within 3 months of JFK being in office, Operation Bay of Pigs, April 17th through the 20th, was scheduled. Now, again, I'm going to point this out because it's a learning thing for me too. April, usually the 19th, but the 17th, I've seen that dates a few times, to the end of April is a 10 to 12 day sacrificial satanic event. You're going to find a lot of things happening during that window. So just notice Operation Bay of Pigs, that was the window they picked. And there's a lie out there that JFK had refused air support. That's really not true. So JFK, the revisionist history goes, JFK refused air support for the exiled Cuban brigade, resulting in failure. But he took public responsibility because he didn't want, in the eyes of the world, to appear like he wasn't in control. But that's not what happened at all. There was a cancellation of the essential pre-dawn airstrike by a Cuban exile brigade bombers that were taking off from Nicaragua to destroy Castro's last 3 combat jets. This airstrike was ordered by Kennedy himself. Kennedy actually signed the order to provide the air support that people in hindsight wanted to say he canceled. He didn't cancel it. Kennedy was always against an American invasion of Cuba, and striking Cubans' last jets on the Cuban Exile Brigade would have limited Castro's threat without the U.S. being directly involved in a regime change. So that's the line that he was willing to go up to. So what do? They do exactly the opposite. They try to give him a black eye by canceling that, leaving the aircraft so they can keep the threat alive, because they want to use Cuba as the threat to be able to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba, and as heard with Operation Northwood, to use American casualties to justify that. Kennedy's order for the airstrike on Castro's jets would be canceled by Special Assistance for National Security Affairs McGeorge Bundy. 4 hours before the exile brigade of B-26s were to take off from Nicaragua. Kennedy was not brought into this decision. CIA Allen Dulles, the man in charge of the Bay of Pigs operation, was incredibly out of the country when all of this was going on. Right? Quote, according to Colonel Purdy, everyone connected with the planning of the Bay of Pigs invasion knew that the policy directive by NSC 5412 positively prohibited the utilization of active duty military personnel in covert operations. At no time was an air cover position written into the official invasion plan. The air cover story had been created and it was incorrect. As a result, JFK knew the source of the fiasco and that he was basically set up. He forms a Cuban study group. The study group consists of Allen Dulles, General Maxwell Taylor, who was a personal military advisor to Kennedy, so that was his guy on the inside, Admiral Arleigh Burke, and Attorney General Robert Kennedy. The failure was It was identified by the report that the failure was due to Bundy's telephone call to General Kabul, Kabell, who was the CIA deputy director that canceled the president's ordered airstrike. Kennedy had them. Humiliatingly, CIA Director Allen Dulles was part of the formulation for conclusion for the Cuban study group. So he basically is kind of putting his own nail in his coffin that the Bay of Pigs operation was a failure because the CIA's intervention, despite the president's orders. This allowed Kennedy to issue National Security Action Memorandum number 55 that was dated June 1961, which began the process of changing the responsibility of the CIA and covert operations back to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. When fully implemented as Kennedy had planned, after his reelection in 1964, it would have taken the CIA out of covert operations. This proved to be one of the first nails in JFK's coffin. I'd say he's already got several in there, but if this was not enough of a slap in the face to the CIA, Kennedy forced the resignation of Allen Dulles, CIA Deputy Director Richard Bissell Jr., and CIA Deputy Director Charles Cabell. So Prouty goes on and compares the Bay of Pig incident to the sabotage of the Crusade for Peace that had happened to Eisenhower. It's basically the same thing. Both events were orchestrated by the president to peaceful dialogue and to Cold War tensions. Both presidents took the onus for the events simply basically as a saving exercise, but because they didn't want people to lose faith in the American government. But it was meant to stir up a public outcry and a subsequent demand for direct military intervention. So on public record is a meeting with CIA Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell and Lyman Lemetsker, who we've talked about, and Navy Chief Admiral Burke, basically trying to strong arm President Kennedy into approving a direct military attack on Cuba. Admiral Burke had already moved several Navy resources into the area, anticipating the U.S. forces would be ordered to attack Cuba to save face in the botched invasion. So they basically set Kennedy up. This incident is what inspired Frankenmeyer's movie 7 Days in May. Kennedy, however, stood his ground, and he says they were so sure I'd give in to them. Kennedy later told Special Assistant to the President Dave Powers, quote, "They couldn't believe that a new president like me wouldn't panic and try to save his own face. Well, they had me figured all wrong," unquote. Unfortunately, it would not be that easy to dethrone Dulles, who continued basically to act as the head of the CIA because the people still in the CIA, like Helms and Angleton, would bypass the new Kennedy director, McCone, and keep Dulles in the full loop anyway. Because keep in mind, Dulles is an icon. I mean, he led the European OSS and was the CIA director. So these people were born and raised in the intel community by Dulles. So there's another rather significant incident that happened around the same time, which gets overlooked because the Bay of Pigs always becomes the topic of conversation. So April 21st through the 26th, 1961, again, that's that window, was a failed coup to overthrow President Charles de Gaulle. The organizers of this coup were opposed to the secret negotiations between the French Prime Minister and the liberation movement in Algeria. On January 26, 1961, just 3 months before the attempted coup, Dulles had sent a report to Kennedy on the French situation that seemed to be hinting that de Gaulle would no longer be around for very much longer. Quote, a pre-revolutionary atmosphere reigns in France. The army and the air force are staunchly opposed to de Gaulle. At least 10% of the officers are. They haven't forgotten the 1958. He had given his word of honor that he would never abandon Algeria. He is now reneging on his promise, and they hate him for that. They hated him for it. De Gaulle surely won't last if he tries to let go of Algeria. Everything will probably be over for him by the end of the year. He will either be deposed or assassinated. Now, this is our chief of the CIA basically telling the new president they're going to take him out. All because he doesn't support imperialism. Now go back and read, listen to the very first of this again, what I was quoting Kennedy as saying, that the Western imperialism is every bit as deadly, if not more so, than the communist imperialism. And I would argue it's more deadly, because they actually try to make them think they're doing it for your own benefit. So the attempted coup was led by a guy by the name of Maurice Chalet. He was part of the OAS Gladio network that was in Dallas on the day JFK, keep that in mind, on the day JFK is murdered. OAS, which is part of the Gladio network in France, was in Dallas. So this is the buildup for Charles de Gaulle kicking NATO out of France. So it says the U.S. intelligence and NATO spreading word to the press, which reported the CIA was a reactionary state within a state. It had operated outside of Kennedy's control. Chalet had recently served as NATO commander-in-chief and had developed close relationships with a number of high-ranking U.S. officers. And that's kind of the whole Gladio was orchestrated, commanded out of NATO. So in August 1962, the OAS, a Gladio unit, made an assassination attempt against de Gaulle, believing he had betrayed France by giving up Algeria. Now, at the end of the day, there's going to be over 20 assassination attempts on Charles de Gaulle. So de Gaulle launched a purge of his security forces and ousted a General Paul Grossin, the chief of his basically special forces unit, Secret Service. Grossin was closely aligned with the CIA and had told Frank Wisner over lunch that the return of de Gaulle to power was the equivalent to the communists taking over Paris. Right. So de Gaulle, and it goes on to talk about de Gaulle withdrawing from NATO, kicking NATO out, pulling all of the French forces out of NATO. And I didn't realize this, but it was not until April 2009 that France finally rejoined NATO. That's crazy. And they probably was at that point strong-armed into it with the European Union and all of that going on. So, and keep in mind that at this point, all of that excluded Great Britain from being part of that. Here it says that back in the first West German Chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, directly appealing to him to try to persuade de Gaulle to backtrack on the veto of keeping Britain out of the European monetary system. So Charles de Gaulle was, I mean, he's the dude. He was a pain in everybody's butt. So um, eventually, we know that they all end up in it. Uh, France and West Germany willingness to work with OPEC countries trading oil for nuclear technology, which was soon sabotaged by the US British alliance. This was another thing that came out of the big food fight of trying to decide whether Britain was going to be in the the pre EU European Trade Union. Um, that at the time, France and West Germany was working with OPEC countries trading oil for nuclear technology. Um, and that's when the US and Britain kind of creates this alliance to try to throw a wrench into all of that. So, June 1961, Kennedy writes NSAM, National Security Memorandum 55. This document changed the responsibility of defense during the Cold War from the CIA to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It would have, if seen through, drastically changed the course of the war in Vietnam. It would have removed the CIA from all Cold War operations and basically forced them to go back to collecting and coordinating intelligence, which is what they were really there for. Um, Another National Security Memorandum 263 was overseen by Kennedy, released and outlined a policy decision to withdraw the 1,000 military personnel from Vietnam by the end of 1963. It further stated that it would be possible to withdraw the bulk of U.S. personnel, including the CIA, by 1965. The Armed Forces Stars and Stripes had the headline U.S. Trap Seen out of Vietnam by 65. Now, realizing later on they try to revisionist history this and say that Johnson goes out on many occasions and says, no, 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 that never happened. Kennedy was all for Vietnam. That's just a bold faced lie. The assassination of Vietnam's president, Diem, likely ordained by the CIA, I would say it was 100%, on November 2nd, 1963, followed by Kennedy's murder just a few weeks later in November 22nd, 1963. By de facto, Lyndon Johnson signed a new National Security Memorandum 273 that was dated November 26th. You got right to business. That began the reversal of Kennedy's policy to remove the forces. He also signed another one that was the full escalation of the Vietnam War that involved millions later. The Vietnam War would continue for 12 years after Kennedy's death, lasting a total of 20 years for Americans and 30 years if you want to count the American Covert Action. And of course, that's the military industrial complex, what they consider a jackpot. Plus, keep in mind, all of the Vietnam was in poppy that the CIA is using to create heroin in a drug trafficking scheme that generates money that they can use to buy weapons on the black market. It's a big circle. By Germany supporting de Gaulle moves against the Anglo-American economic stranglehold on Europe, his adamant opposition to Western imperialism and the role of NATO, and with a young Kennedy building his own resistance against the imperialist war in Vietnam and imperialism in general, the powerful elite was in trouble. So then he goes on to talk, the author goes on to talk about the Warren Commission and the official report as being, a conspiracy theory if you think anything other than the magic bullet. But Alan Dulles, of all people, was essentially the head of that commission. Now, I just explained to you that Alan Dulles was unceremoniously fired for insubordination, and he then gets basically put on. It was under Warren. Alan Dulles ran it. in charge of the cover up of the assassination of the guy that, in my opinion, he just had assassinated. Lovely. So the reader should keep in mind that much of the frothing opposition stems from the very agency that perpetrated the crime, and they're now going to be running it. So when has the CIA ever admitted guilt unless being caught red-handed? That would be never. When the CIA was found guilty of planning out foreign assassinations during the Church Commission, the CIA agency representatives claimed that they had failed in every single plot, or that someone else had beaten them to it, that they didn't actually do the assassination, which is garbage. The American people need to realize the CIA is not a respectable agency. We're not dealing with honorable men. They believe themselves above the law. And I would add the FBI to that now. So Churchill referred to the CIA as one published state critique of the CIA in the Washington Post and blah, blah, blah. Yeah, I should have never done it. It's sinister, foreign intrigue, but again, revisionist history. Alan Dulles writes a memo and puts it in the files of the CIA that supposedly he had a conversation with Truman, and all of that was a misunderstanding and it was misquoted, and Truman never said that. So every step of the way, the picture I'm trying to paint for everybody is that every step of the way, is it bad again? Every step of the way, there is the CIA trying to cover their butt. So again, in the window of April 21st, 1964, upon returning to Washington, Dulles writes that letter and puts it in the file and basically contradicts all of the Truman's regret. Prouty would state that anyone with a little free time during the afternoon could discover for themselves the Warren Commission was an embarrassingly incompetent hodgepodge that conducted itself as if it were a done deal that Oswald killed Kennedy, and was disinterested in hearing anything contrary to that point. So Jim Garrison, God bless him, was a district attorney in New Orleans from 62 to 73, and was the only one to bring forth a trial concerning the assassination of President Kennedy. In his book, he says Hoover comes up several times impeding and shutting down investigations into JFK's murder, in particular concerning the evidence collected by the Dallas Police Department, such as the nitrate test Oswald was given, which exonerated him, proving he had never even shot a rifle that day. The fact was kept secret for 10 months. It was finally revealed in the Warren Commission report, but buried. And even that didn't help. He shot Kennedy, but never had a gun in it. Oswald's interrogation file went missing in the Dallas Police Department. Damning, particular damning incident was concerning the Zapruder film in possession of the FBI, which they had sent a copy to the Warren Commission for their investigation. This film was one of the leading pieces of evidence used to support the magic bullet theory and showcase the direction of the headshot wound. During Garrison's trial on the Kennedy assassination, he subpoenaed the film that for some particular reason had been locked up in a vault owned by the CIA affiliated Henry Luce of Life magazine. So you have a film that documents the assassination of a US president, and Life magazine has it in a safe. This was the first time in more than 5 years that the film was made public. It turned out the FBI's copy that was sent to the Warren Commission had 2 critical frames reversed to create a false impression that the rifle shot was from behind, when in fact it was not. When Garrison got a hold of the original film, it was discovered that the headshot was actually from the front. In fact, that the whole film showed the president had been shot from multiple angles, meaning that there was more than one gunman. When the FBI was questioned about these 2 critical frames and how they could have gotten reversed, their response was it was a technical glitch. Such frickin' liars. Besides Oswald's nitrate test and the Zapruder film, another key piece of evidence that was clearly tampered with was Kennedy's autopsy reports. Kennedy's original autopsy papers were destroyed by the chief physician, James Humes, to which he even testified during the Warren Commission. Apparently, nobody bothered to ask why. During another investigation, in case y'all don't know, into it was the Assassination Records Review Board that happened in 1994. Congress basically passed the JFK Assassination Records Collection Act of 1992. And it mandated that all assassination-related material be housed in a single place, not the Life magazine office. So in July 1998, a staff report was released, and it outlined the autopsy problems. One of the many tragedies of the assassination had been the incomplete autopsy records. And I mean, this just gets downright ridiculous. The review board contended the brain photos of Kennedy's records are not Kennedy's brain and show much less damage than what Kennedy actually sustained. So they've got the wrong photos, several of them actually. Ask about, in the Washington Post, this is a quote, ask about the lunchroom episode where he was overheard stating the notes of the autopsy went missing in May of 1996 deposition. Flint said he did not remember it. He was also vague about how many notes he took during the autopsy, but confirmed that after the autopsy, I also wrote notes, and that he turned over whatever notes he had to the chief autopsy physician, James Humes. It was later reported that Humes destroyed some of the original autopsy papers in his fireplace 2 days after the murder. He told the Warren Commission that he had burned was the original draft of the autopsy report. Under persistent questioning in 1996, Humes said he destroyed the draft and his original notes. So, shown official autopsy photos, the lady that had taken the pictures and worked in the White House lab said that they were not the ones that she helped process and were printed on different paper. She goes on to say there was no blood or opening cavities, and the wounds were much smaller in the pictures that she processed. So again, all of the documentation of the assassination of Kennedy has been screwed with. The Warren report had to acknowledge that there was evidence tampering, but then puts the question of reliability of the entire assassination record in question. But again, noting all of this happening, they still find there's a magic bullet answer. Among the strange and murderous characters who converged in Dallas in November 1963 was the notorious French OAS, Operation Gladio, commando named Jean Sorchetti. It's Souetre, who was connected to the plots against President de Gaulle. He was arrested in Dallas after the assassination and then immediately expelled to Mexico with zero questioning. So let me translate that for you. They picked him up and escorted him out of the country to freedom. So we go on. After the funeral, de Gaulle and his information minister had a candid conversation that was recorded in the information minister's memoirs, which this is the quote. What happened to Kennedy is what nearly happened to me. His story is the same as mine. It looks like a cowboy story, but it's only on OAS story. The security forces were in cahoots with the extremists. Security forces are all the same when they do this kind of dirty work. As soon as they succeed in wiping out the false assassin, they declare the justice system no longer needs to be concerned, that no further public action was needed now that the guilty perpetrator was dead, i.e., Oswald. Better to assassinate an innocent man than to let a civil war break out. Better an injustice than disorder. America is in danger of upheavals, but you'll see all of them together will observe the law of silence. They will close ranks. They'll do everything to stifle any scandal. They will throw Noah's cloak over these shameful deeds in order to not face in front of the whole world, in order to not risk unleashing riots in the US, in order to preserve the Union and to avoid a new civil war, in order to not ask themselves questions. They don't want to know. They don't want to find out. They won't allow themselves to find out. And I find that just so blatantly true. Below is John F. Kennedy's address before the American Newspaper Publishers Association on April 27th, 1960. Now, I'm going to read this because this is him talking, and I want y'all to know everything that we've talked about Operation Gladio. I want you to think about that when I'm reading these words, because I've read this like a million times. I read it the other day, and it basically blew my mind. Every word, secrecy, is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are as a people inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the danger which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it is within my control. And no official in my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic, and that means a single massive whole entity, a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned. No rumor is printed. No secret is revealed. It conducts the Cold War, in short, with a wartime discipline no democracy could ever hope or wish to match. Right? Gladio. I just had chills reading that again. And like I said, I read it 50 times. He is describing Gladio. Guerrilla by night, not armies by day. Infiltration, not invasion. I mean, every bit of it. And about the silencing of people, reporter after reporter dead. The judges all dead. I mean, when we read Operation Gladio, our last book, I mean, it got to be a joke towards the end of the book, because I could be reading a scenario and we knew as soon as the words came out of my mouth, oh, this reporter found out this, dead man walking. Literally everything that JFK just articulated, he was describing Operation Gladio. I mean, I'm dumbfounded. Great research on JFK. Yeah, so really is just putting them, and again, all the praise goes to Cynthia Chung. She has done an excellent job in the flow of this book and presenting the material. I kind of struggle with in a chapter, she will talk about one time period and she goes back. I would prefer her to kind of set the time frame up and go chronologically, because it's a little confusing. I've noticed, but that would be my only critique of this, that and the whole Roosevelt worship. But I just can't say enough about this book and how it builds the and you're going to see in the upcoming chapters, you will continue to be blown away. But I thought her ending that chapter with those quotes by JFK encapsulates everything he knew, and they had to kill him because he knew. He knew what they were doing. He had seen the inside of the sea monster, and they killed him for it. That's basically it. Okay, so I want to read a few of the comments. Brian says, I grew up hearing about the heroes, the early OSS guys, real badasses. Yeah, yeah, they were all crooks. 100% crooks. And then, so let me also, that's a great point, Brian, because in the hidden history book and some of the other books that I've read that that outlined in the lead up to World War II with Meyer Lansky and all of the New York crime families, and how they worked with the naval intelligence in the beginning to secure the harbor. And, you know, they basically, Meyer Lansky was not Lansky, sorry. What's the other guy? The guy, Meyer Lansky worked for him. His name's going to escape me, but he's the one he was in jail for prostitution. He was in charge of the whole mafia, Lucky Luciana. So he's the boss. Lansky worked for him as the financial guy. So Lucky Luciana gets sent to prison for prostitution. In the lead up to World War II, they work a deal with intelligence that he's going to go to Sicily and he's going to lay out the whole crime families in Sicily's help to basically overthrow Mussolini's forces there, because keep in mind, Mussolini had eliminated all the Masonic lodges in Italy and had eliminated all of the mafia. And of course, I really struggled with this because everybody tells us Mussolini's really bad, but he gets rid of all the vices. So, it's a give and take thing. They're not all bad or all good. So anyway, Lucky Luciani gets deported, and goes to Sicily and basically aids the military and the CIA, or OSS at the time, invasion of southern Italy. So, what you find, in making a long story short, is the collusion of military intelligence with OSS as the precursor to the CIA, and how embedded the mafia was in all of that. They basically took the criminals that were into every vice, the running of drugs, the running of weapons, the running of whatever, humans, money laundering. They took all of those vices and created a house under the element of the US government called the CIA. The CIA, and the OSS was exactly like it, was the official embedding of the mafia infrastructure into the US government, giving it the full weight and protection. So they basically just created a house for the bad element. It was never about collecting intel. The NSA can do that. Um, I have this channel. Let's see. I really apologize for the glitches. Um, yeah, Dwayne, I agree. The OSS thing, well, the whole military thing stabs me in the heart. All of my heroes, Eisenhower, a lot of these guys were big heroes in my book, and I've got a lot of them's biographies. What's going to be interesting is, after I get done with this, and the discovery of Operation Gladio, is to go back and read some of their biographies, um, and what they actually have to say. Okay, so do we have any other questions? I'm just kind of going back through here. Roxanne talked the other day about the genuine revolution to toss out the Western controllers. Yeah, yeah. The whole I have a friend of my sister's that was the Spanish translator for Publix at their corporate headquarters in Lakeland. And when I get back home, I'm going to reach out to her. Her mom and dad lived in Cuba, and she came here. I think she was like 13 when they came here. I really want to talk to her about what impression her mom and dad left on her, about the whole goings on there, since I found out all of the information about Cuba. It would be great to have that insight. Um, so anyway, um, that's all I've got. If no one has any questions or anything, our next chapter is going to be chapter 8. It's the CIA, NATO, and the Great Heroin Coup, and how it also continues with some aspects of the Kennedy murder, and how it wraps up into an international fascism kind of movement. All ran out of Miami. And again, that kind of is like a big shocker for me, too. So we'll continue a little bit more with the aftermath of the fallout of JFK's murder, and how it relates to the whole opium network. So that's all I got. Thanks for being here.